let me just say that this entire program is in celebration of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution as it pertains to the original Camden District. This is not just Camden, this is Camden District, which included quite a few other modern counties. And we're presenting this program today to highlight a very important event that took place here in Camden for that district on November 5th, 1774. That was the day that the grand jury of the Camden District, inspired by a speech by Circuit Court Judge William Henry Drayton, recommended what some historians have called a veritable little Declaration of Independence. This was 2 years before the true Declaration of Independence. And this presentment that they signed with their names, think about it, 1774, and they signed this paper. And they asked that it be laid before the General Assembly and published in local newspapers. As I think we all remember what John Hancock said about signing this paper, which is in a way tantamount to treason. So these people really were, they believed in what they were signing, and they were putting their names to it. So I think that's pretty amazing. Now, in order to give us some background on the importance of the 1774 resolves and on the backcountry itself, Joanna Craig here is going to put the history of Camden and the backcountry into perspective. Ms. Craig is a direct descendant of Joseph Kershaw, and she retired after 25 years as the director of Historic Camden Foundation. So, Joanna?
Good morning, everybody. I have the daunting task of trying to put Camden's incredible history in about a 40-minute presentation. I first want to apologize to all of the people who have come before us in Camden that should be here, and there was no way I could fit them in. With that said, I'm going to start from the very beginning. Almost 500 million years ago, a massive range of ancient mountains extending from today's Virginia to the Gulf of Mexico rose from the chaotic formation of the Earth's still cooling surface. The passing of millions of years would whittle down these mountains, considered some of the world's oldest landmasses, into the rolling red hills known as the South Carolina Piedmont Plateau. Deposits from an ancient ocean and its ever-shifting shoreline covered much of the state, including parts of Kershaw County. It finally receded to form the flatlands of South Carolina's coastal plain and its sandy, dry region known as the Sandhills, which weaves through the county. Geologically, where the Piedmont Plateau and the coastal plain meet is known as the fall line, often represented by a noticeable drop in elevation causing swift-moving coastal-bound rivers to produce rapids or waterfalls that inhibit upland navigation by riverboat beyond the fall line. The United States has only one fall line, the 900-mile Atlantic seaboard fall line that runs from the Atlantic coast through New Jersey, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Notable cities such as Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Raleigh, and Columbia share their fall line beginnings with Camden. As early settlements, each grew to satisfy the demand to transport people and goods that were obstructed by fall line impasses. Camden developed just below the fall line of the 222-mile Wateree River, which downstream joins the Congaree River to form the Santee and empty into the Atlantic. Formed from the Blue Ridge mountain streams that form the Catawba River, the river is renamed the Wateree as it flows into Kershaw County. It is named after Native American tribes, primarily the Waterees, that once lived on its banks. The Waterees were not the first to inhabit the area, however. From about 12,000 BC to 950 AD, the native presence slowly evolved from the nomadic, primitive Paleo-Indians who followed the trails of soon extinct massive beasts to the advanced hunters and cultivators who established permanent villages along the rivers. About 950 AD, Mississippian people moved into the Wateree Valley. They would introduce to the soon hostile local Indians their complex, rank-based society with its elaborate social and religious hierarchy. The intruders, later known as the Mound Builders, built elaborate villages, palisaded for protection, along the river. Included in many of their village complexes was a large earthwork mound averaging about 65 feet in height. Atop the mound was a thatched roof residence for the ruling elite, public structures, and temples and burial grounds, if such structure were not already assigned their own mound. In nearby villages lived the commoners. They were the actual designated mound builders and food producers of the caste system. Advanced cultivators, they planted corn in the middle of the mounds, beans along the slopes to enrich the soil, and squash between the mounds to grow cover and be a wildlife deterrent. Along the east side of the Watery River in Kershaw County are the remains of mound sites confirmed by archaeologists to have connections with the Mississippians. The ceremonial Adamson Mound includes the remains of a large platform mound, 2 smaller mounds, and a burial area. The Belmont Neck site downriver features remnants of a platform mound and a town believed to be linked to the chiefdom of Cofetachequi. The Mulberry Mound site, just south of Camden at Mulberry Plantation, is currently recognized as the principal town of Cofetachequi. Once a rich and powerful nation in the South Atlantic region, and then ruled by a female chief known as the Lady of Cofetachequi, the chiefdom was already in decline, possibly from disease spread by other European contact, when Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto arrived in April 1540 in search of gold. Accompanied by 600 conquistadors, a dozen priests, Indian captives, 300 horses, bloodhounds, and droves of pigs, De Soto was ceremoniously greeted and accepted hospitality and provisions from the young ruler for several weeks. Looting of the temples by De Soto's men for precious metals revealed a treasure trove of freshwater pearls, copper, and mica, but no gold. De Soto and his men stole as much as they could, kidnapped the queen as insurance against attack, and proceeded on their quest. At one point, the lady escaped with the most valuable chest of pearls. De Soto died of fever on the western banks of the Mississippi in May 1542. His soldiers wrapped his body in blankets filled with sand and tossed it in the river. Motivated mostly by religious conflict, money, and power, Spain, England, and France would finance other European explorers to visit the future colony and its hinterlands for possible expansion of their empires. At the time of European contact in 1492, some 20 tribes inhabited future South Carolina, representing divisions of the Algonquin, Iroquoian, Muscohegan, and Siouan nations. The Siouan tribes, believed to be offshoots from the Western Sioux, lived between the coast and the Santee, Broad, and Catawba River areas, including the Wateries, the Catawba, and other Midland tribes. When Juan Pardo visited the area in 1566 through 68, he wrote about the Gutari and the Iswa, ancestors of the Wateries and the Catawba. Spanish explorer Veranda referred to the Catawbas as Isa in 1569, and German explorer John Lederer was from Virginia. He had contact with the Usaris, also the Catawba, 100 years later. Interestingly, it was the Europeans who introduced the term Catawba around 1715 to describe the natives inhabiting the upper banks of the Catawba River. Within 30 years, the tribe would use the new name rather than their own Iswa, or people of the river. Although the Cofetachequi were still active, when English explorer Henry Woodward visited this area in 1670, they had vanished by the time fellow countryman John Lawson ventured into the Watery Valley in 1701. Lawson and his party were returning from a 500-mile, 2-month trek through the central and upper regions, commissioned by the Lord Proprietors of the province of Carolina, who wanted their lands surveyed and described for possible future promotion and development. Lawson's detailed encounters with indigenous tribes, including the Wateries and the Catawba, and his sketches of the flora and fauna would become a very popular travel book encouraging migration to Carolina, entitled A New Voyage to Carolina, which was published in 1709. On March 24, 1663, Charles II signed the Charter of Carolina, granting a vast territory in North America, designated the province of Carolina to 8, quote, trusty and right beloved, unquote, English nobles, called the Lord Proprietors, as reward for supporting his restoration to the English throne. The province stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast and southern Virginia to the border of Florida. But what would become the colony of South Carolina and North Carolina when it was divided in 1712 was the main interest of the proprietors. The 8 noblemen remained in England and appointed others to run the 2 colonies as outlined in their founding guidelines, the Fundamental Constitution of Carolina. While some of the concepts of the manifesto proved unwieldy and unpopular with the new settlers, the policy permitting religious tolerance had broad appeal. The fledgling port town of Charlestown, named in honor of Charles II, started with the arrival of 150 adventurous colonists from England who sailed by way of Bermuda into the harbor in the spring of 1670. Most of the early newcomers, however, came from Barbados, the wealthiest of England's American colonies. Enriched by lucrative sugar plantations, many successful planters migrated to Charlestown in search of additional lands to expand their fortunes. Accustomed to their slave-driven plantations, the transplants bought their slaves and established a similar plantation system along the coast that would dominate the South for almost 2 centuries. Cultivated with great success were cash crops of rice, the dominant crop within 30 years, and indigo. Each was well suited to the coastal environment and southern climate. Each was also in much demand by the mother country. The plantation crop supplemented the already very successful export of deerskin and Native American slaves that was establishing Charlestown as the center of the economic activity. Overland transport for both of those commodities relied on the extensive network of Indian trails and footpaths, some prehistoric, that reached as far west as the Mississippi and terminated in Charlestown. Although the Indian slave trade faded after the smallpox epidemic of 1698, the deerskin exchange would remain a major resource for revenue for the colony and the Catawbas well into the 1750s. The often used Catawba Indian Trail, which for us is part of Broad Street today, would later be extended to become a major connector to the main route leading to the northern colonies, establishing Fredericksburg as a strategic trading link between Charlestown, the northern colonies, and the backcountry. Remote and sparsely populated in the beginning, the backcountry considered the area stretched from about 50 miles inland to the mountains, would end up retaining about 80% of the colony's population by the time of the American Revolution. With the influx of new settlers, armed with skills and experiences from their homelands of France, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, Switzerland, and Holland, Charlestown soon became a bustling trade center. By the 1760s, it would be one of the largest and wealthiest cities in British America. The expansion of the rice plantation economy, however, resulted in huge increases in African slave labor, making the city's slave population the majority by 1708, and a perceived and later real threat to the planter elite who ran the city. The bloody stick, the ancient call for war that the coastal Yamasee tribe passed around to the other tribes in 1715, including the Wateries and the Catawbas, signaled the beginning of the devastating Yamasee War against the English. Incited by unkept government promises, Indian trader abuses, and continued encroachment of native lands, the conflict would put nearly 400 white settlers to knife, rifle, or fire and destroy numerous settlements before the Indians were soundly defeated and a peace treaty was signed in 1718. During the same year, a smallpox epidemic that greatly weakened the Wateries and the Catawbas led to the forming of a confederacy of the Midland Siouan tribes, making the Catawbas the dominant tribe of the interior. In declaring peace, the Catawba pledged to assist the king and the colonists in all manners, including future war conflicts. Their allegiance would figure prominently in Camden's future. In 1729, the British Crown, under King George, reclaimed the ownership of the province through buyouts with the Lord Proprietors in response to complaints that concluded political conflict, corrupt officials, unpaid taxes, incompetent proprietors, open rebellion, conflict with natives, and rapacious pirates, unquote. Royal oversight meant the appointment of the colony's governor, and the approval or disapproval of all laws were going to be controlled by the king. The existing governmental infrastructure, such as the Board of Tribes that was vital to the Low Country's economic interests, government agencies, the military, and the Church of England were all also under the royal governance. Only the Common House of Assembly, the lower branch of the General Assembly, was comprised of men who were elected by the parishes. To qualify for election, candidates had to be white, 21 years or older, and own at least 500 acres of land. Over time, the Assembly had become powerful and managed both the purse and the strings and the appointment of commissioners, the church wardens, and other important people of the royal crown. The wealthy planters and merchants in control were determined that all political matters were going to remain in Charlestown, a major sticking point with dissatisfied backcountry settlers in the future. The parish system had been established in 1706 and modeled after those in England and Barbados. It made the Church of England the official religion and established 10 parishes in the colony's 4 original counties. Future Kershaw County was in Craven County. The parishes were served by an appointed Anglican church, governed by elected officials, and served as election districts. In time, both the daily church and the local government activities would be handled by the parishes. By the early 1730s, shortages of coastal land for newcomers and the colony's dire need for economic stability and safety craved attention. Of utmost concern to the coastal elite was the, quote, growing internal danger of the Negro slaves, thick sown in our plantations, that require our utmost attention to keep them in order, unquote. Fresh from London, newly appointed Royal Governor Robert Johnson would bring a bold solution to the colony's vulnerabilities when he arrived in Charlestown in 1730. Johnson's radical scheme, approved by George II, would increase the colony's white population by attracting and resettling new immigrants, mostly poor Protestant European farmers, to the interior, which was currently populated by just a smattering of families, Indian traders, and various local tribes. The settlers would be expected to provide militia to defend Charlestown against Indian attack, intrusions by the Spanish or French, and slave revolts, plus increase the production of agricultural crops to fill the king's coffers. The Assembly enthusiastically approved what would be known as the Township Plan. As conceived in the plan, each of 11 townships, 9 in the backcountry, was to be surveyed along one of the colony's major rivers 50 miles inland. Each was to contain 20,000 acres of mostly farmland, except about 200 to 300 acres earmarked for a future English-style town. To entice takers, each settler would receive a half an acre of land in town, plus 50 acres per each family member, including indentured servants and slaves, and free rent for 10 years. The Board of Trade sweetened the offer with funds for tools, food, and transportation that they derived by putting on a heavy import tax on slaves to be paid by the postal planter elite, which was extremely unpopular for them. In December 1733, the Royal Council retained James St. Julian, a planter trader who had recently helped with the settlement of Georgia, for a sum of £500 to survey a township on the River Wateree in the area known as the Waterees. After careful consideration, St. Julian laid out a site along the east side of the river, with the town site located just below present-day Camden. The township was named Fredericksburg, presumably in honor of the Prince of Wales, Frederick Lewis, who was the father of George III. Even though no land grants had yet been issued for Fredericksburg Township, perhaps because of the complexity of the process itself, the Wateree Indians, highly agitated that their lands were being offered as incentives, visited Charlestown twice to secure compensation for their lands. Unsuccessful in their attempts, they permanently relocated farther upriver under the umbrella of the Catawba Nation. A more drastic response to the unwelcome settlers was the killing of a family near Pine Tree Creek in 1736 by a group of Chiraws. Other Indian attacks would follow. Historic Camden Volume 1 states that James Ousley was the first landowner in Fredericksburg with a grant of 300 acres on the west side of the river in 1733. That would be where Invista is today. Initially, however, settlement was extremely slow, undoubtedly influenced by several Charlestown slave uprisings, a monumental fire that almost destroyed the city at the decade's end, plus the royal conflict of the King George War of 1740 through 1748, and periodic flare-ups with Spanish Florida. Between 1745 and 1750, though, newcomers to the area increased dramatically, as did land grants issued to both sides of the river. To the consternation of the scheme planners, some 50 warrants were issued to large tract landowners from the Low Country, often speculators, and to homeowners from Virginia and Pennsylvania, instead of those anticipated farmers from abroad. Eventually, farmers, most with families, would come by way of the Atlantic and the Wateree and put down roots. With dogged determination, the settlers cleared the land, erected fences, constructed log cabins and farm buildings, and planted and harvested crops for survival. Little semblance of a community, let alone a town, existed, just scattered plantations along the river, far from the bustle of Charlestown and even farther from home. Vital to community growth was the construction of grist mills to produce flour and other grains, and sawmills for lumber for houses and farm buildings. Township funds were available for mill construction, and that would launch the successful operation of some of the early mills along the area's creeks and streams. By the 1760s, local milling operations were aggressively producing flour and other commodities for profit regionally, turning the town into a major center of trade. Transportation remained a problem, however. The roads to the coast were mostly crude, and the Fall Line Road, which connected Virginia to Georgia, went through Fredericksburg. That would be Route 1 today in Camden. And that was not a much better road. The wateries below the Fall Line, in constant demand to transport people and goods to the coast, was often inhabitable because of a huge logjam of submerged trees downriver known as the Raft. Although the rudimentary travel systems and remote location limited access to the coastal markets, Such hindrances did not deter a colony of Irish Quaker to emigrate and settle peacefully and industriously in the area in 1750-51. The group soon established plantations along the river and joined the other pioneer farmers in producing commodities soon to be sold for profit in Charlestown. The business ventures of Quaker leader Samuel Wiley were numerous and successful. An established farmer and mill operator, Wiley also owned a trading store popular with his neighbors and the Catawbas. From the multiple land tracts he owned, he conveyed 4 acres to the Quakers in 1759 for a meeting house and burial grounds, which is today, of course, our Quaker cemetery. As royal appointed Indian agent to the Catawbas, Wiley formed a close relationship with King Haigler, our beloved patron saint of Camden. When Haigler was appointed king of the Catawbas in 1753, a fierce warrior, Haigler was also an unswerving protector of the colonists, feared opponent from unfriendly tribes, and a staunch defender of his own people. The continued encroachment of Catawba lands and disastrous reduction to less than 1,000 tribe members from another smallpox epidemic in 1759 convinced King Haigler to negotiate the Treaty of Pine Tree Hill in 1760. Granted by the king, the treaty gave the Catawba title to 144,000 acres in today's York County. Not official until 1763, the treaty would bear the name Haigler, signed by Samuel Wiley in honor of his heroic friend, whose life had been cut short the previous summer when, quote, a lurking party of Shawnees poured a volley into him from ambush and took his proud scalp. In 1753, the Assembly approved a petition from Fredericksburg settlers for transportation improvements to facilitate commercial growth to Charleston, which inhabitants felt were very justifiable because, after all, our community now included a tavern, a store, and a mill. While road improvements to accommodate horse-drawn wagons hauling up to 3 tons of goods was slow, the raft logjam to the waterway was cleared in timely fashion. The unencumbered waterway would enable Camden to later function as a busy inland river port, which flourished till about 1850 when poor river navigation and the construction of railroad bridges ended the era. The death of campaigning Major General Braddock in 1755 during the French and Indian War provoked Indian raids in the western frontiers of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia by tribes that were loyal to the French. The terrorizing triggered a mass migration of mostly Scotch-Irish Presbyterians to the Carolina backcountry. Some came by way of the Fall Line, but most traveled the Great Philadelphia Wagon Trail, which went from Philadelphia to Augusta, Georgia. A segment of that road is up on Flat Rock Road, and in fact, there are visible traces of it you can see on the Camden battlefield. Whether the newcomers became landowners or indigent squatters, their arrival changed the composition of the backcountry and underscored the need for influence for religious purposes and judicial oversight. By 1757, about 800 lived on both sides of the river, including 12 families who resided right around here in the Quaker meeting area. The same year, Fredericksburg was included in the new St. Mark's Parish, the colony's first backcountry parish. Inclusion in the parish would finally provide access to a parish church, the lack of which had deprived the inhabitants the, quote, comfort of preaching for the gospel, being 140 miles distant. Equally important, inclusion permitted qualifying farmers and tradesmen from the parish to be elected and receive voting privileges to the assembly. Availability of such privileges to men the coastal elite considered, quote unquote, uncivilized, reconfirmed their resolve on the coast to keep everything in the assembly and in Charlestown. Many of the inhabitants fleeing from the wrath of the Cherokees during the 1758-61 Cherokee War were law-abiding citizens. They resettled peacefully and helped strengthen the economy base here. Those who lived in the remote areas farther inland, however, were soon labeled, quote, low people, riffraff, idlers from the northern colonies, unquote. Many became outlaws, indiscriminate destroyers of property, even murderers. Encouraged by the lack of law enforcement, initially preying on the travelers on the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road, they rapidly led to marauding gangs who were terrorizing the whole region with impunity. Repeated and unheeded appeals for protection from the indifferent authorities in Charlestown would soon incense the property owners and merchants in the backcountry to take matters into their own hands. Ever on the outlook for new commodities to export, Charlestown merchants, including William Ancrum, determined the production of wheat looked promising. A partner in a new firm in Charleston, Ancrum, Lance, and Lucott, he convinced wealthy Quaker families in Philadelphia to finance such a venture here in Fredericksburg. On June 58, Ancrum received a plat marked Pine Tree Hill for his new 150-acre grant on Pine Tree Creek, which depicted the land feature, including a hill right behind us, populated with pine trees. The firm would establish their branch store there and hire an energetic, savvy 30-year-old English immigrant named Joseph Kershaw as agent, soon partner, to oversee what would be called Kershaw and Company. Tradition says Joseph Kershaw named the isolated Fredericksburg area Pine Tree Hill. Perhaps he was inspired by the wording on Ancrum's plat. Kershaw's knowledge of cultivating wheat for market, which was the base of his vast fortune, provided the needed stimulus for Kershaw and Company to successfully ship fine Carolina flour fresh from Pine Tree Hill to Charleston within a couple of years, and later to markets as far away as Boston. He later built buildings of sawmills, indigo works, a tobacco warehouse, a brewery, a distillery, plus purchases of land tracts for resale, which would inspire investments in Pine Tree Hill by other budding entrepreneurs, such as later partner John Chestnut and brother Eli Kershaw. Within 10 years, Pine Tree Hill had emerged from a wilderness to the center of commercial production and trade in the Carolina backcountry. At the instigation of Kershaw, the booming town was renamed Camden in 1768 in honor of Lord Camden, Charles Pratt, who adamantly opposed Parliament's right to, quote, tax without representation of the American colonies. Interestingly, the last several years, local historians Joan and Glenna Nabonet have been swapping information with a London group overseeing the Camdens Around the World project. After intense research of the origin of places named Camden throughout the world, the group has determined that Camden, South Carolina, to be the first place named Camden. The continued attacks on outlying inhabitants since the Cherokee War had become so ruthless that even the Camden militia, quote, were afraid to go after the outlaws for fear of retribution. Finally, in the summer of 1767, the irate prominent men of the backcountry had had enough. They formed a vigilante movement called the Regulator Movement, which by year's end had about 500 active members and some 3,000 to 6,000 ready to serve. Their goal, rid the area of outlaws, establish a sense of law and order, and present a petition of grievances to the Assembly in Charleston. After all, they were tax-paying citizens, and they got nothing in return. The day of reckoning was at hand. With the assistance of 2 companies of Rangers, all the gangs were finally defeated by the next spring. The Regulators, however, next decided to deal with, quote, the rogues and other idle, worthless, vagrant people, unquote, in their communities in need of discipline. Their heavy-handed methods, not dissimilar to those of the outlaws and unauthorized, led to others in our community to form the Moderator Movement to halt the assault of the Regulators. In other words, regulate the Regulators. The 2 groups were fast heading for a major confrontation and in desperate need of royal intervention. Charles Wood Mason, the Anglican minister who is currently based here in Pine Tree Hill, was secretary and spokesman for the Regulators. In November 67, he presented a remonstrance of 23 requests down in Charleston, basically for courts, courthouses, jails, and schools. Before he delivered the Regulator a threat to attack the city if their requests went unheeded, Woodmason boldly admonished the men in the assembly, quote, "Such are the men who bounce and make such noise about liberty, freedom, property, rights, privileges, and whatnot, and at the same time keep half of their fellow subjects in a state of slavery," unquote. In response to the demands and threats of the regulators and pending clash between the two movements, the Assembly finally created the Circuit Court Act of 1768. The act replaced the colony's original 4 counties with 7 court districts. Each district would have its own judicial seat, courthouse, jail, and sheriff. Traveling circuit court judges from Charlestown would administer the legal affairs of the communities in each of the districts. Camden was made the judicial seat of the large Camden District. The decision to install the long overdue judicial system did not come without scars, however. Deep-seated hatred and bitterness between brothers, families, and neighbors, brought on by the regulator and moderator movements, would resurface when the winds of war came south in 1780. Charles Woodmason, who had arrived in Camden in 1776, had been hired for a 10-year search for an Anglican minister by the church. For 6 grueling years, he would travel over 3,000 miles, organize more than 30 widely scattered congregations, and rode constantly from one settlement to another, exhorting, marrying, baptizing, and advising the settlers on all their problems. Abundant in his opinions and his convictions, Woodmason chronicled his years in a private journal, which was published as the Carolina Backcountry on the eve of the Revolution in 1969, and a fabulous read if you ever want to get into it. In 1770, heated disputes between the Assembly and now represented by people in the backcountry such as Joseph Kershaw and John Chestnut and Englishes and various people, the Boykins, and the royal officials regarding policies and taxation led to the government actually shutting down between 1771 and 1775. But far removed from all those disputes, Camden here was enjoying a time of prosperity and growth. No Indian attacks, no outlaws, no regulators, and no moderators. The new courthouse and the jail were finished in 1771, and the circuit court judge was making scheduled visits to the town twice a year to settle disputes. By 1774, the Low Country had totaled more wealth than many nations in the world today. And it was controlled, though, by the revolutionaries in the Assembly who had serious grievances against the king. The backcountry, however, was mostly Tory, still had grievances, but they were against the Assembly for numerous promises still not being met. In 1774, the king granted Camden to host a fair twice a year, and surveyor John Hurd submitted a new plan of Camden to be laid out on a grid pattern and feature a central town square and 630 lots with designated spaces for the courthouse, the jail, the Church of England, which actually never was built, and the market. Also that year, Joseph Kershaw, now a member of safety, rode around the backcountry with Chief Justice William Drayton and Reverend William Tennant to enlist support of the fledgling rebel cause sought by the Low Country elite. It was mostly unsuccessful. And on November 5th, 1774, Mr. Kershaw, why,
Good
how
evening.
nice of you to join us today.
Well, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the magistrate is almost finished handing out punishments. Judge Drayton will be here shortly, and the circuit court is about to be in session. I invite you to come with me.